Hi everyone. I'll be going through the weed aspects of this. This project was designed by Gauss and myself, and most of the work was done by Dr. Sultan Mia, who has since moved into the horticulture group. What does amelioration do to your weeds? Well, that's a really, really complex story. Essentially, it buries the weed seeds. How many it buries and how deep they go is going to influence how well they germinate and when they germinate. If there are any weeds there when you did the amelioration, you probably killed some of them, not all of them, even with a moldboard. And obviously, you're trying to change your crop growth with your amelioration, so you'll change crop-weed competitive interaction. Today I'm going to talk about two areas. One is a survey of soil inversion sites, and the other is the trials that Sarah briefly touched on at Yerracoin, Darkin and Williams. These trials had two things in common. The first was that they were all to look at the whole agronomic system, Steve Davies' soil constraints, Sarah's pathogens, and the weeds. The other thing they had in common was that they all had the same four amelioration treatments: the control, deep ripping, spading, and inversion. This is what soil amelioration does to the weed seeds. You can see there's little pictures of soil profiles. The weed seeds are the white dots at the top in that topsoil. In a normal conventional system where you've got a no-till, knife points, press wheels, most of the weed seeds are in the top 2 centimetres, but their total depth will be down to 7 to 12 centimetres, just depending on what your seeding depth is. If you're using deep ripping, you're pulling a furrow in the soil, and that reliably gets some of the topsoil and weeds slotting down into that furrow. If you use soil mixing, then you are mixing as promised, and the full soil inversion with a moldboard or a one-way disc plough tries to take all of that topsoil and put it at depth. This is Sultan's survey. He went to about a dozen sites throughout the wheat belt. It took him a while. At each site, he dug a trench to see how deep the moldboard was. These sites might have been inverted any time from 1 to 10, 13 years ago. But luckily, that soil profile is still there and easy to see 10 years later. He took soil cores from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and 30 to 40 centimetres. Now, these were all nice sandy sites. They had good deep soil amelioration. The shallowest was down to 25 centimetres, but they were getting down to 35, 45 centimetres in some places, really deep. What emerged was mainly annual ryegrass, bit of subclover and capeweed. Great brome came up too in these sites that had been ameliorated maybe 3 to 4 years ago, not the sites that had been ameliorated 10 years ago. That little table down the bottom shows you where the seeds were coming up from. Obviously, there were plenty of weed seeds in the top 0 to 10 centimetres, because that's where the weeds are. We've got new weeds dropping new seeds in that topsoil. Most of the rest of the weeds were at 0 to 10 centimetres, even though in all these sites, the amelioration was deeper than that 20 centimetres. There's a lot less seeds getting to 20 to 30 or 30 to 40 centimetres. What we're finding reliably is that when you do a soil inversion, the weed seeds reliably get to half your working depth. And that makes sense. Think about a plastic tub. If you got a shovel full of soil and put it in a plastic tub and gave that tub a tiny bit of a shake, all the crop residue, the weed seeds, the lighter fraction would just shuffle their way to the surface. So essentially, when you're doing a moldboard, that's what's happening to the weed seeds. As you go through with your soil inversion, they just shuffle their way to the surface. Okay, number 2, let's get on to Sarah's amelioration sites. Yerracoin, Darkin and Williams had very different soil types. Yerracoin was nice, soft sand all the way down. And at that site, the amelioration was at about 35 centimetres. At Darkin, slightly heavier sand with some rocks. and the amelioration wasn't quite as deep. And at Williams, much more solid soil with a lot more gravel. And the amelioration depth of working was about 15 to 20 centimetres. So all these tables show you the percent weed seed burial at each depth. Now you see at Yerracoin and Darkin in the control, there's about 80% of the weed seeds in the top 0 to 10 centimetres, and a few of them are below 10 centimetres. At Williams, all the weed seeds are in that top 10 centimetres in the control, which gets back to what I just told you. If you have a normal no-till system, your weed seeds are reaching a maximum depth of 7 to 12 centimetres. If I know the control numbers at Yerracoin and Darkin are exactly the same. I did double check that, they really are exactly the same. In the inversion plot, at Yerracoin and Darkin, we had about 90% of the weed seeds buried to 10 to 20 centimetres. And there weren't really a lot of seeds getting beyond 20 centimetres. And at Williams, after an inversion, all the weed seeds were still at 0 to 10 centimetres, which also gets back to what I just told you. In an inversion, your weed seeds get to half your depth of working. So at Yerracoin, if your depth of working is 35 centimetres, your weed seeds are mostly going to end up at 15 to 20 centimetres. And at Williams, where your depth of working was 15 to 20 centimetres, that was a really hard soil, the weed seeds are at 5 to 10 centimetres. Deep ripping was the only technique where weed seeds reliably got down to your full depth of working at all the sites, but the number that got buried was really variable. And you can see that spading, those numbers are also pretty variable. So what deep ripping and spading do to your weed seeds really varies due to every site. I can't tell you a hard and fast rule for those ones. Yep. This is weed growth at Yerracoin and Darkin. For these sites, there was amelioration in 2019, and then directly after that, the crop got sown. Then there was 2 more years of crop growth. I'm not going to show you Williams, because the weed growth at Williams was pretty uniform over the whole site, regardless of amelioration, because they were all sitting at 0 to 10 centimetres. At Yerracoin, the first thing I want you to notice in these 2 graphs is that at both sites, a full soil inversion did a fantastic job of clearing up the ryegrass. You can see there's a little bit of ryegrass creeping in after the inversion at Darkin, but it was less than 1 plant per metre squared. It was pretty clean. The other thing I want you to notice from these 2 graphs is that control, ripping and spading, ryegrass density was pretty similar. I know you're thinking, look at those numbers at Yerracoin. The control had about 55 ryegrass per metre squared in that first year, and ripping had closer to 80 plants. But that number was only just barely significantly different. And a little bit later in the season, that difference had disappeared, and head number ryegrass seed production was identical. And at Darkin, there was no difference at all between control, ripping and spading in that first year. Let's have a look at grape brome. And these 2 graphs, I want you to notice the same 2 things. The deep ripping, spading and control, weed density is pretty similar. So ripping and spading were not stimulating weed growth. Inversion was not as good at getting grape brome out of the way. Don't get me wrong, it did a pretty good job. It reduced the grape brome grass, but you can see in these both trials that grape brome is sneaking back into the system. And yeah, Darkin, the grape brome is still much lower after an inversion, but yeah, that was 50 plants per metre squared 3 years later. And these are trials where there was normal chemical use. We're not trying to grow the weeds. We were trying to get them under control. We just failed at Darkin until we had the Roundup Ready canola in the last year. What does all this mean for management? Well, A full soil inversion is really great at getting your weeds under control if they've got a small seed, like ryegrass. If you bury ryegrass seed to 10 centimetres, it's not going to germinate. If you bury grape brome to 10 centimetres, then some of it will germinate. So you need a plan to manage those large seeded weeds going forward. Ripping and spading had really variable results, but the key point is we all just assumed they would stimulate weed growth the same way an autumn tickle does, and they consistently did not, probably because the weeds on the top were stimulated, but enough weed seeds were buried that overall the population staying pretty similar. And thank you to all these people and to GRDC for their support.